know something close to your heart. We're seeing a real pushback from the UK because of this security crackdown from China, talking about it taking in a humanitarian intake and urging Australia to do the same. Should we, and how many could Australia take on?
Well, it's auspicious we're talking about this because, of course, today is also the 31st anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and that's another day that needs to be remembered and honoured, particularly because the Chinese Communist Party is trying to suppress vigils in Hong Kong of that memory and that legacy. In terms of how many asylum seekers Australia can take if people apply for asylum, ultimately that has to be considered based on the number of people who apply. I've raised this issue internally previously, about making sure that there's a pathway, and the minister's confirmed that within our existing humanitarian program, we're more than capable of taking people who fear persecution because of their political beliefs or because of their political action in Hong Kong. But it's about people wanting to come and apply in order to create that pathway for themselves.
You also understand it's a zero-sum game, as you described it there. What about a special humanitarian intake, a la what happened with Syria and Australians taking another, I think it was 12,000 people, separate to our general intake? Is that appropriate in this case?
Well, I think it comes down to whether people want to apply to leave Hong Kong, because when I've had these conversations with Hong Kong activists in the past about their pursuit of standing up against their own, the government appointed essentially by Beijing versus going to another country, they've said they want to stay back and fight, and they want to fight for their future and for the future of their territory. So it comes down to whether it's necessary, and I think all of these things, will be appropriately considered as the situation unfolds. The UK has obviously been making requests to our government. I'm not privy to those conversations, but you know that my position will be naturally sympathetic that Liberal Democrats of Chinese origin would have a natural home in our country, who believe in economic and social progress and for a liberal democratic society.
What about the other element the UK is looking at, sanctions against effectively Hong Kong, China? Should Australia look at that as well?
Well, I mean, all options should always be considered on these sorts of issues, but considering these options have to be done in a context not just of what you could possibly put up, but what's going to be effective to bring about change. Now, I'm sure our government, as always, is open to considering any option, but we also, as an individual nation, need other countries to stand up. You've pointed out to the UK, but we also need other freedom-loving countries like the United States to stand up and to support free people everywhere. As we all know, they're, shall we say, insular and distracted at the moment. And this is sadly one of the prices of having a US which isn't as fully engaged as we like around the world.
Just on that situation, our former ambassador to the US, Dennis Richardson, also, of course, a top bureaucrat, has said this is all being made worse by a president that relishes division. Is he right?
Well, I'm not going to get into a running commentary on President Trump's administration, but it's pretty obvious to me, looking at what's occurring in the United States, that there is a test of how far a sense of justice within a society can be pushed. And there are a lot of people who think that the United States has become an unjust society. And the task of any national political leader is to bring people together, to heal a nation, and to be able to get a sense of common purpose and unity where everybody's working towards broadly the same objective, the type of country they want to be. At this point, it's quite clear to me, as I'm sure it is to everyone around the world, that that is not being achieved. So it's a task for the president to stand up and become that healer.
Is he failing the task at the moment?
Well, the task isn't over, but some of the footage that a lot of us have seen suggests very clearly that hasn't been achieved. And now it's his task and his responsibility to heal the nation, to bring people together and to build the type of the United States, frankly, that I grew up with, that you grew up with, that I think everybody wants to see, which is a united nation focused on the advancement of its people and international peace and stability. And that's a critical role we need played in the world right now, internationally, as well as, of course, for Americans domestically. But just because there's obvious divisions within the United States, it doesn't justify or validate the case for violence. As Daniel Andrews, the Victorian Premier, who I'm not often quoting, says, you know, peaceful, if it's violent, it needs to be peaceful to be a protest. Violence is not a virtue.
Good to hear you quoting Daniel Andrews, Tim Wilson. Just finally on debt in Australia. Obviously, we've got a very different situation with COVID-19, particularly where we were a few months ago with the coalition saying we'd be paying off debt. Does there need to be not necessarily a hard cap on our debt, but at least something to aim for, a debt to GDP level, for example, that wouldn't risk our AAA credit ratings? Does that need to be a focus for your government?
Well, I think that's absolutely been the focus of our government. What the Prime Minister has said at every point throughout this COVID-19 pandemic is that the measures we're introducing are temporary, and we're not introducing measures that are going to be permanently baked into the budget that are going to do things like bring down our credit rating. They're going to put us in a position of unsustainable debt to pass on to future generations. If there's any criticism that we've had of previous responses to crises, it's been that, is baking in costs passed on by future generations with no sense of prudence or responsibility. Yesterday, the Treasurer and the Prime Minister circulated data showing that one of the reasons why Australia has been able to contain the economic impact of COVID-19 is because of the action we took before the COVID-19 pandemic. We were prudent, we were responsible, and as a consequence, we're in a better position to help the Australian people get through this crisis, but there is further steps ahead.